When you think of comic book heroes, who do you think about? Superman, Spider-Man, maybe Batman? Asaf Hanuka's superheroes were child soldiers in Burma. Asaf is a comic book artist, and he teaches illustration and comics here in Shenkar. Now he will take us through his journey, from reality to fantasy and back to reality. And it all started with one front page of a magazine. Asaf.
On February 2000, there was an amazing cover on Newsweek magazine. It was the story of Johnny and Luther Hatu, twins who led God's Army, a military guerrilla group in Burma in the late 90s. It's hard to believe, but these kids were able to defeat the Burmese army with just a handful of stolen rifles. And so people started believing that they have an army of ghost soldiers and that they can speak with the gods. People really believed that they possessed superpowers. These twins do not possess any powers. I know it for a fact because it's my brother, Tomer, and myself. We grew up in Israel in the early 80s in a place called Kiryat Ono, and we were lucky to have a safe childhood. It was so safe, it was sometimes even boring. And there was no danger, but there was nothing much to do except one thing which we loved, and that is comics. And more specifically, superhero American comics, which we read obsessively over and over again, to the point that we started thinking that we will become superheroes. Eventually, instead, we both became illustrators and comics artists, which is as far as you can get from being a hero. But when we discovered the story of the Hatus, we thought it would be a perfect material for a graphic novel, because this story had all the ingredients of a modern mythology with a major plus. It was a real story. And there was also something personal, and that is looking at these twins for us was like looking into a twisted mirror where everything we dreamt of as kids, they lived in reality. Our fantasies were somehow existing in their lives. So we started working on a series of character design, sketch, research, but we didn't have a good story. So we talked with our good friend, writer Boaz Lavi, and together with producer Ron Proper, we formed a creative team. Boaz's first decision as the writer had a huge impact. He decided that actually we're not going to tell the story of the Hatu twins, but a fictional story that would be based on reality. So we moved from fact to fiction, from fantasy to reality. New characters were introduced. Mark, an American explosive expert living in Texas with a pregnant wife and financial difficulties. Mark joined his friend Jason, and together they leave to do a job in an imaginary country in Southeast Asia called Kwanlom. They assist the local army when suddenly Mark is kidnapped by a group of child soldiers led by two twins with magical powers. In our story, these twins are called the Divine. The Divine, intent on forcing a major showdown between their ancient magic and against the military. So, why was this change in the story so important? It was important because it was the first time that we were able to introduce some of our own reality into the fantasy of the story. We started with a story about kids in the jungle with magical powers and ended up telling a story about a guy who was freaking out about becoming a father and running into the jungle to have last adventure. I think that all of the team members, we're all in our 40s and we have young children, so we all know this crisis where at some point you just have to let go of your childhood dreams in order to become a responsible adult. The Divine was published in 4 languages. It was on the New York Times bestseller list on the week of its release, and it won the gold medal in the international manga competition from Japan. And one last twist ending to the story, and this happened in real life, and that we got a message on Facebook. and it was Luther Hatu from the Hatu twins. Somehow we found out about the book, and he found us on Facebook. And he wanted to know everything about us. Who are we? How do we look like? So we sent him pictures and told him. And it was a funny moment because suddenly we were the magical twins from an imaginary country in the Middle East he never heard of. He was in his 30s, and he told us he was living in Switzerland on a refugee status. Years ago, God's army was captured in Thailand. All members were executed because they were labeled a terrorist organization, except for the brothers Johnny and Luther. They were spared because they became, by that time, a national symbol. Luther told us that he plans to go back to Burma and reunite with Johnny, and that he will never give up on fighting. So after this chat with Luther on Facebook, I felt a bit confused and uncomfortable. Were we in any way benefiting from these people's distress? Because we did use their faces in a comic book, which is a commercial product. The Divine took us 5 years to make, and during these 5 years, we looked at hundreds of photos of Johnny and Luther running in the jungle. We used them like actors in a fictional story, and it was easy at some point to forget that these were real people, not just aesthetic inspiration. I think that in every creative process, there is a mix of fact and fiction, like putting salt in a cake, and it's what art does best, which is to give us a glimpse into an elevated reality that is both very exciting but carries a message. But how far can we go before we hurt the people who inspired us in the first place? I teach illustration and comics in Shenkar for almost 15 years, and I always encourage students to mix reality and facts in their fictional stories, but also to be aware that once this story is out there in the world, it becomes part of a global conversation, and you have to be able to stand behind it. After the book came out, in every review, the story of the Hatu twins was mentioned. Readers told me they went online and read about the terrible suffering and injustice in Burma. People were once again exposed to the story of the Hatus and to the ugly consequences of adults making bad decisions. So I think if we as artists in some way helped in raising awareness to this issue, then that's a good enough reason to keep on creating and to keep combining facts and fiction. Thank you.